Death at the White Elephant Sale. Good evening, my friends. My name is Stephen, and welcome to Mindful Musings. I invite you to find your comfort tonight, perhaps with something warm to drink, a soft blanket wrapped around your shoulders, and the gentle stillness of evening settling around you. Tonight, we journey once more to the village of Lochdubh, where the December cold bites deep and secrets hide beneath layers of Highland hospitality. Our story begins at the church's annual Christmas White Elephant Sale, where wrapped gifts and cheerful laughter mask something far more sinister. When death arrives in festive paper and ribbon, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth must untangle a web of theft, betrayal and revenge that has been years in the making. Now tell me, do you enjoy these quiet winter evenings when mysteries unfold by firelight? If so, I would be grateful if you would subscribe and join me on these contemplative nights. Together we will explore the shadows that gather in the Highlands, where every wrapped gift might contain more than meets the eye. Now, let us begin. Death at the White Elephant Sale, a Hamish Macbeth mystery. Chapter 1. The Gift That Should Not Have Been Opened. The first Sunday of December arrived in Lochdubh with a coating of frost that turned the village into something from a Christmas card. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood in his small kitchen, watching his dog Lugs investigate a suspicious smell coming from beneath the refrigerator, with the dedication of a creature who took such matters seriously. Through the window, Hamish could see smoke rising from chimneys, and the first Christmas lights beginning to appear in cottage windows. It was the sort of peaceful morning that made him grateful, once again, that he had resisted every attempt by his superiors to promote him away from this corner of Sutherland. Let Detective Chief Inspector Blair chase criminals through the rain-soaked streets of Strathbane. Hamish had his village, his dog, and the kind of quiet that settled into your bones like good whiskey. The church Christmas White Elephant Sale was scheduled for that afternoon, an annual tradition that brought the entire village together in the church hall for tea, biscuits, and the exchange of wrapped mystery gifts. The rules were simple. Everyone brought a wrapped gift worth no more than £10, drew numbers, and took turns selecting presents from the pile, or stealing already opened ones from other participants. It was meant to be light-hearted fun, though Hamish had witnessed some surprisingly fierce competitions over the years. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, had cornered him after services the previous week to ensure he would attend. "You must come, Hamish," she had insisted, her formidable bosom heaving with the importance of the matter. "Community participation is essential, and we need someone to keep things orderly. You know how competitive it can get." Hamish did know. 2 years ago, the Curry sisters had nearly come to blows over a tin of shortbread that turned out to be from the pound shop in Strathbane. Last year, Dr. Brodie had ended up with a hideous ceramic cat that now served as a doorstop in his surgery. The White Elephant Sale was chaos wrapped in Christmas cheer, and Hamish suspected his real job would be preventing the theft of the good gifts and managing the disappointment over the terrible ones. He arrived at the church hall just after 2 o'clock to find the place already packed. Long tables held wrapped packages of every size and description, some clearly books, others mysterious lumps that could be anything. The air smelled of pine from the Christmas tree in the corner, mixed with the ever-present church hall aroma of old wood and furniture polish. Margaret Linden was there, arranging gifts on the table with her usual efficiency. She was a tall woman in her early 40s, with greying hair pulled back severely and eyes that held a permanent sadness. Her mother had died 6 months earlier, a long decline into dementia that had required round-the-clock care toward the end. Hamish had seen Margaret at the funeral, dry-eyed and controlled, accepting condolences with polite detachment. Also present was Janet Morrison, the home care nurse who had tended to several of the village's elderly residents over the past 3 years. She was a cheerful woman in her 50s, plump and comfortable-looking, with a quick smile and gentle hands. Everyone spoke well of her dedication and kindness. She had cared for old Mrs. MacLeod during her final illness, had helped the Reverend's mother after her stroke, and had been with Margaret's mother, Helen Linden, during those last difficult weeks. Hamish watched Janet chatting with Mrs. Wellington, both women laughing at some shared joke. There was nothing about her that suggested anything other than a competent professional who genuinely cared for her patients. But then, appearances in the Highlands could be deceiving. The gift exchange began promptly at 2:30. The Reverend Macpherson drew names from a hat, calling out numbers in his gentle voice while Mrs. Wellington supervised the proceedings with the stern efficiency of a general commanding troops. Number 14 was called, and Jessie Curry marched forward to select a small square package wrapped in red paper. The afternoon proceeded with the usual mixture of delight and disappointment. Dr. Brodie unwrapped a bottle of decent whiskey and looked genuinely pleased. Someone else got a pair of rubber gloves and a sponge. The Reverend himself ended up with a mystery novel that looked well thumbed. When number 27 was called, Janet Morrison stepped forward with a smile. She selected a medium-sized box wrapped in elegant silver paper with a white bow. The wrapping looked more expensive than most, and several people made envious sounds as she carried it back to her seat. Hamish, standing near the refreshment table, with a cup of tea, felt an odd prickle of unease. He could not say why. The gift looked harmless enough. But something about the way Margaret Linden was watching Janet, her face carefully blank, made him set down his cup and move closer to where the nurse sat. Janet was working at the ribbon, her fingers pulling at the bow. The paper crinkled as she began to unwrap it. She lifted the lid of the box beneath. There was a soft hiss, barely audible beneath the chatter and laughter filling the hall. Then Janet's smile faltered. Her hand went to her throat. She tried to stand, stumbled, and fell backwards out of her chair. The room erupted into chaos. People screamed. Someone knocked over the Christmas tree. Hamish was already moving, pushing through the crowd, but he could see from the way Janet's body convulsed that it was already too late. Her face had gone a terrible greyish blue, her eyes wide and terrified. Dr. Brodie reached her first, his hands gentle as he checked for a pulse. Hamish saw him shake his head, saw the way his face went pale. When the doctor looked up, his voice cut through the panic with professional authority. "Everyone out. Now. Do not touch anything. Hamish, call for an ambulance and the police from Strathbane. Tell them we need a hazmat team. I believe we're dealing with poison gas." Hamish was already reaching for his mobile, his mind racing. Murder! Here, in the church hall, wrapped in silver paper with a white bow. Someone had brought death to the Christmas white elephant sale, and from the look on Margaret Linden's face as she stood frozen by the gift table, Hamish suspected he might already know who. Chapter 2. The Nurse Who Kept Secrets. The church hall had been evacuated and sealed off within 20 minutes of Janet Morrison's death. The ambulance crew, arriving from Strathbane with a paramedic trained in hazardous materials, confirmed what Dr. Brodie had suspected. The gift box had contained a small glass vial of hydrogen sulfide gas, rigged to break open when the lid was lifted. Death would have been swift but agonizing, the gas overwhelming the lungs and shutting down the central nervous system. Hamish stood outside in the December cold, watching Detective Chief Inspector Blair lumber out of his car with the grace of a man who resented having his Sunday disturbed. Behind him came Detective Sergeant Anderson, looking tired and professional as always, and a crime scene team carrying equipment cases. Blair's red face was already showing signs of the temper that would make the next few hours miserable for everyone involved. "Macbeth," he bellowed across the car park. "What kind of bloody circus are you running up here? Poisoned Christmas presents? This is supposed to be a quiet village, not bloody midsummer murders." Hamish remained calm, as he always did with Blair. The more agitated the inspector became, the more deliberately peaceful Hamish grew. It was a dynamic that had served him well over the years. The victim is Janet Morrison, age 53, home care nurse. She opened a wrapped gift at the church white elephant sale and inhaled what appears to be hydrogen sulfide gas. Dr. Brodie confirms she died within minutes. Hydrogen sulfide. Blair's face went even redder. Where does someone get hydrogen sulfide in a place like this? You cannot just pop down to the chemist for poison gas. "Actually," Hamish said mildly, "you can make it fairly easily with common household chemicals, drain cleaner, and certain types of acid. The information is readily available online for anyone determined enough to look." Blair muttered something uncomplimentary under his breath and stumped toward the church hall. Anderson gave Hamish a sympathetic look before following his superior. The crime scene team began setting up their equipment, and Hamish was left to reflect on what he had observed in those chaotic moments after Janet's death. Margaret Linden's face. That was what kept coming back to him. Not shock, not horror, but something closer to grim satisfaction. She had watched Janet Morrison die, and there had been no surprise in her eyes, only a kind of terrible relief, as if a long, anticipated moment had finally arrived. He thought about Helen Linden, Margaret's mother. The old woman had been a fixture in Lochdubh for decades, a teacher at the village school before her retirement, known for her sharp mind and sharper tongue. The dementia had come on suddenly, or so it seemed. Within months she had gone from organising the church flower rota to not recognising her own daughter. The decline had been swift and cruel. Janet Morrison had been her primary caregiver during those final weeks, visiting the house daily to help with bathing, feeding, medication management. Hamish remembered seeing the nurse's cheerful little car parked outside the Linden cottage, remembered Margaret's haggard face when they passed on the street. Everyone had sympathised with her burden. When Helen died, there had been a small funeral, well attended but not elaborate. Margaret had sold the cottage and its contents shortly after, moving into a smaller flat above the bakery. She had seemed to want nothing more than to put the whole sad chapter behind her. But what if there had been more to it than grief and moving on? What if something had happened during those weeks of home care? Something that had planted seeds of rage in Margaret's heart. Dr. Brodie emerged from the church hall, stripping off latex gloves. His face was grave as he approached Hamish. The hazmat team has secured the gas container. Nasty piece of work. Whoever made that device knew exactly what they were doing. The vial was positioned to break when pressure was applied to the lid. Simple, but effective. Any idea how long she would have suffered? Hamish asked quietly. Brodie's expression darkened. Seconds, perhaps a minute at most. Hydrogen sulfide attacks the nervous system. She would have been conscious initially, aware of what was happening, but unable to breathe, unable to call for help. He paused, then added, "It is a cruel way to kill someone. Personal." Hamish nodded slowly. That confirmed his suspicions. This was not a random attack or a prank gone wrong. This was murder, carefully planned and executed with the specific intention of making Janet Morrison suffer before she died. "I need to speak with everyone who brought a gift to the exchange," he said, "particularly Margaret Linden. Blair will want to handle the interviews himself," Brodie warned. "You know how he is about maintaining control." "Aye," Hamish agreed, "but Blair does not know these people the way I do. He does not know what to look for." Inside the church hall, now illuminated by portable lights brought by the crime scene team, the wrapped gifts sat in silent accusation on the tables. One of them had contained death. The others, harmless trinkets and joke presents, seemed suddenly sinister in retrospect. Any one of them could have been the murder weapon. Anderson approached with a notebook. "We are going to need a list of everyone who attended and who brought which gift. Mrs. Wellington says she kept a record of who participated, but the gifts themselves were not labelled." "That is the whole point of a white elephant sale," Hamish said. "The mystery is part of the fun. You bring a wrapped gift, put it on the table, and no one is supposed to know who brought what." Anderson sighed. "Which means our killer could have brought the poisoned gift and simply waited for someone to select it at random. This might not have been specifically targeted at Janet Morrison at all." But Hamish shook his head. "No. Look at the wrapping, that silver paper and white bow. It is more elegant than most of the others, more expensive looking. The killer wanted it to be chosen. They wanted it to be appealing. And Janet went straight for it," Anderson observed, "almost as if she could not resist. Or as if someone who knew her well understood exactly what she would choose," Hamish said quietly. The two men stood looking at the gift table, at the cheerful chaos of Christmas wrapping that had become a crime scene. Outside, Blair was shouting at someone about proper procedure. Inside, the evidence of calculated murder sat waiting to give up its secrets. Hamish thought about greed and revenge, about the things people did when they believed they had been wronged. He thought about Margaret Linden's empty eyes and Janet Morrison's reputation for kindness. Somewhere between those two images lay the truth, and he intended to find it, whether Blair wanted his help or not. Chapter 3. The Missing Heirlooms and the Grieving Daughter. By Monday morning, the investigation had shifted into the methodical phase that Hamish both appreciated and found frustrating. Blair had set up a command centre in the church hall, turning Mrs. Wellington's domain into a chaos of coffee cups, files, and the inspector's cigar smoke. The entire village was being interviewed, a process that was taking far longer than necessary because Blair insisted on conducting most of the interviews himself, complete with bombastic accusations that put people's backs up. Hamish, relegated to what Blair called support duties, had taken a different approach. He spent Monday morning visiting the elderly residents who had been cared for by Janet Morrison over the past 3 years, carrying a thermos of tea and an air of casual conversation that put people at ease far more effectively than Blair's interrogation tactics. Mrs. MacLeod, now recovered from the illness that had required nursing care, welcomed him into her sitting room with the enthusiasm of someone who got few visitors. She was 92, sharp as a tack despite her physical frailty, and more than happy to talk about Janet Morrison. "Oh, she was wonderful," Mrs. MacLeod said, pouring tea with hands that trembled only slightly. "So patient with me when I was poorly. She would read to me, you know, when my eyes were too weak, and she never once made me feel like a burden." "Did she ever mention any other patients?" Hamish asked gently. "Perhaps someone who was particularly difficult?" Mrs. MacLeod thought about this. Well, there was Helen Linden. Poor Helen. The dementia was terrible, just terrible. Janet said she was a challenging case because one day she would be quite lucid, and the next she would not know where she was. Must have been hard on Margaret. "Did Janet ever say anything else about the Linden case?" Hamish pressed. The old woman's face clouded. "Now that you mention it, there was something. Janet seemed troubled the last few times she visited after Helen died. I asked if she was all right, and she said something about feeling guilty, that she should have noticed something sooner. I thought she meant Helen's decline, that she blamed herself for not catching it earlier. Nurses can be hard on themselves that way." Hamish made a mental note and continued his rounds. At the Reverend's house he spoke with Mrs. Macpherson, the minister's mother, who had recovered from her stroke with Janet's help. She was very good about the medication schedule, Mrs. Macpherson recalled. So organised. She had a little notebook where she kept track of everything for all her patients. Dosages, appointments, family contacts. Very professional. A notebook. That was interesting. Hamish had not seen any such notebook in the preliminary search of Janet Morrison's cottage, which the police had conducted the previous evening. Either it had been well hidden, or someone had removed it. His final visit of the morning was to Margaret Linden herself. She lived in a tidy flat above the bakery, accessed by a narrow stairway that smelled of fresh bread. When she opened the door, her face was pale but composed, as if she had been expecting him. "May I come in, Margaret? Just a few questions, if you do not mind." She stepped back without a word, letting him enter. The flat was sparsely furnished, everything neat and in its place. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal touches that might suggest a life beyond mere existence. It was the home of someone who had stripped away everything unnecessary, keeping only what was essential. They sat in her small kitchen, and Hamish accepted the tea she offered, noting how her hands were perfectly steady as she poured. "I know what you are thinking," Margaret said quietly. "You think I killed Janet Morrison." "Did you?" Hamish asked, his voice gentle but firm. She met his eyes directly. "If I said yes, would you arrest me right now?" "I would ask you why." Margaret was silent for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her teacup. Then she began to speak, her voice low and measured. "My mother was a brilliant woman, Constable, a teacher, a reader, a thinker. When the dementia started, it was like watching her being erased piece by piece. But there were still moments when she was herself, when she would recognize me and we could talk. Those moments meant everything." Hamish waited, sensing there was more. "She had jewellery," Margaret continued. "Nothing tremendously valuable, but precious to her. Her mother's engagement ring, a pearl necklace my father gave her for their 25th anniversary, a gold bracelet she had worn every day for 40 years. She kept them in a wooden box in her bedroom." "And they disappeared," Hamish said softly. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I noticed the pearl necklace was gone first, about 2 weeks before Mother died. When I asked Janet about it, she seemed surprised, said she had not seen it. Then the bracelet vanished, then the ring. By the time I thought to check the entire box, nearly everything was gone. All that remained were a few costume pieces worth nothing. Did you confront Janet? Hamish asked. I did, Margaret said, her voice hardening. She denied it completely, said Mother must have moved them somewhere and forgotten. But Mother could barely get out of bed by then. She could not have moved anything. And Janet was the only person besides me who had access to that room, who knew where the jewellery was kept. Hamish felt a chill run through him. And after your mother died? I started asking questions. Carefully. Quietly. I spoke with Mrs. MacLeod's daughter, with the Reverend. Both mentioned small items that had gone missing during their relative's care. A silver spoon here, a small painting there. Nothing large enough to report, nothing that could be proven. But a pattern. Margaret stood and went to a drawer, pulling out a folder. Inside were photographs of jewellery, receipts and insurance documents. This is everything she took from my mother. I documented it all. Showed it to the police in Strathbane 6 months ago. They said there was insufficient evidence to pursue charges. Janet Morrison was a respected healthcare worker. My mother had dementia. I could not prove she had not simply misplaced the items or given them away before she became ill. Hamish looked through the documents, his heart sinking. The case Margaret had built was compelling, but entirely circumstantial. Any lawyer would have torn it apart in court. So you decided to take justice into your own hands, he said quietly. Margaret looked at him with eyes that held no regret. I decided that someone needed to stop her before she stole from anyone else, before she used her position of trust to rob more families during their most vulnerable moments. How did you make the poison device? The internet is remarkably educational, she said calmly, and I have always been good with my hands. My father was an engineer. He taught me how to solve problems, and you wrapped it in expensive paper, made it attractive, knowing Janet would choose it. People gravitate toward beautiful things, Margaret said, even people who have spent years stealing beauty from others. Hamish felt a wave of sadness wash over him. Margaret Linden was not a monster. She was a grieving daughter who had watched her mother's final treasures vanish into the hands of someone sworn to care for her. But grief did not justify murder, no matter how righteous the anger behind it. I will need to take you to Strathbane, he said gently. You know that. Yes, Margaret replied. I've known that since yesterday afternoon. I packed a bag. Before we go, Hamish said, one more question. The other thefts you mentioned from Mrs. MacLeod and the others, do you have evidence of those as well? Margaret handed him another folder, this one thicker. I have been investigating Janet Morrison for 6 months, Constable. Every patient she cared for, every family that trusted her. The thefts go back 3 years. She was systematic about it. Never took anything too valuable, never anything that would be missed immediately. But altogether, she stole thousands of pounds worth of heirlooms and keepsakes from people who could not defend themselves. As Hamish drove Margaret Linden to Strathbane, watching the hills roll past under a grey December sky, he thought about justice and vengeance, about the fine line between the two. Margaret had committed murder. That was indisputable. But Janet Morrison had been a thief of the worst kind, stealing not just objects but memories, final connections to loved ones from families in their darkest hours. Blair would have his killer. The case would be closed. But Hamish suspected the real story was just beginning to emerge, and the truth, when it all came out, would shake Lochdubh to its foundations. Chapter 4. The Evidence Hidden in Plain Sight. The interview room at Strathbane Police Station was painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Hamish sat in the corner while Blair conducted his interrogation of Margaret Linden, watching the inspector's bombastic approach bounce off the woman's calm composure like waves against granite. You expect us to believe, Blair bellowed, that you murdered a respected nurse because you think she pinched a few baubles from your daft mother? That is your defence. It is not a defence, Margaret said quietly. It is the truth. Anderson, sitting beside Hamish, made notes in his precise handwriting. He looked up briefly, caught Hamish's eye, and gave a barely perceptible shrug that suggested he too found Blair's tactics counterproductive. Hamish's mind was not fully on the interrogation. He was thinking about Janet Morrison's cottage, about the notebook Mrs. Macpherson had mentioned, about the systematic nature of the thefts Margaret described. If Janet had indeed been stealing from her patients for 3 years, there would be evidence. Thieves, particularly successful ones, tended to keep records. They needed to know what they had taken, where they had sold it, how much they had made. "Sir," he said, interrupting one of Blair's tirades, "with your permission, I would like to conduct a more thorough search of Janet Morrison's property." Blair turned his red face toward Hamish. "A more thorough search? My team went through that cottage yesterday. If there was anything to find, they would have found it." "Perhaps," Hamish said diplomatically. "But sometimes local knowledge helps. I know how people in Lochdubh think, where they might hide things." Blair snorted, but waved a dismissive hand. "Fine. Take Anderson with you. Keep him out of my hair while I deal with this one." An hour later, Hamish and Anderson stood in Janet Morrison's cottage, a neat little house on the edge of the village with a view of the loch. The police search had left things somewhat disarrayed, but the basic character of the place remained. It was the home of someone who valued comfort and order, filled with soft furnishings, pleasant watercolours, and the kind of knickknacks that tourists bought in gift shops. "Nothing here suggests a thief," Anderson observed. "If anything, it looks like she already had plenty of things." "That is the point," Hamish said, running his hand along a bookshelf. "She did not steal because she needed money, at least not desperately. She stole because she could, because she had access to vulnerable people who would not notice or could not complain." He thought about hiding places, about where a careful person might keep incriminating records. Not somewhere obvious, not in a desk drawer or filing cabinet. Somewhere that looked innocent, that would be overlooked in a casual search. His eye fell on the collection of books on nursing care, medical references and health guides that filled one shelf. He pulled them out one by one, checking for hollowed-out pages or papers tucked inside. Nothing. Then he noticed something odd. One of the books, a thick volume on geriatric care, seemed lighter than it should be. He opened it and found that the pages had been glued together and a rectangular space carved out of the centre. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. "Anderson," Hamish said quietly, "I think I have found something." The notebook was a damning piece of evidence. Janet Morrison had kept meticulous records of her thefts over 3 years. Each page detailed a different patient, items taken, dates, and estimated values. She had even made notes about which pieces were sold to which dealers in Inverness and Glasgow, along with the prices received. Helen Linden's jewellery was all listed. Pearl necklace, sold to an antique dealer in Inverness for £90. Gold bracelet, £240. The engagement ring with its small diamond, £400. Every item Margaret had photographed and documented, every piece of her mother's history, reduced to a line in a ledger. But Helen Linden was not the only victim. Mrs. MacLeod was there, with a silver tea service stolen piece by piece over the course of her care. The Reverend's mother had lost a miniature painting and several first-edition books. There were 8 names in total, elderly residents of Lochdubh and surrounding villages who had trusted Janet Morrison with their care and had that trust betrayed. "Christ," Anderson breathed. "This is worse than we thought." She was systematic about it. Hamish felt a cold anger settling over him. Janet Morrison had not just stolen objects. She had stolen memories, final connections to loved ones, pieces of family history that could never be replaced. And she had done it with a smile, with gentle hands and kind words, all while cataloguing her crimes in a secret notebook like a grocer taking inventory. "We need to contact these families," Hamish said. "They deserve to know what was taken and where it went. Some of these items might still be recoverable." Anderson nodded. "This changes the investigation." Margaret Linden's motive just became a lot more credible. They returned to Strathbane with the notebook, arriving to find Blair in an even fouler mood. The inspector's interrogation had not gone well. Margaret refused to show remorse, insisted that Janet Morrison had deserved what she got, and generally behaved like someone who had no interest in defending herself. "What have you got, Macbeth?" Blair demanded, eyeing the notebook suspiciously. "Evidence," Hamish said, handing it over. Janet Morrison was a systematic thief. She documented everything she stole, where she sold it, what she received. 8 families, 3 years of theft. Margaret Linden was telling the truth. Blair flipped through the notebook, his face growing redder with each page. This changes, he sputtered, clearly struggling with the implications. This makes the victim a criminal. How am I supposed to? He trailed off, unable to articulate the problem. Anderson stepped in smoothly. It gives us clear motive for the murder. It also suggests that if we contact the dealers mentioned in the notebook, we might be able to recover some of the stolen property and return it to the families. Blair sat down heavily, the notebook open in his lap. In his years on the force, he had dealt with all manner of criminals, but something about this case seemed to defeat his usual bluster. A nurse stealing from dying patients, a daughter murdering the thief who robbed her mother. There were no winners here, no clear villains or heroes. Right, he said finally. Anderson, start contacting these dealers. Macbeth, you will need to inform the families. And someone get me a drink. This case is giving me a headache. As Hamish left the station, the winter sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the car park. He thought about the conversations he would need to have, the wounds he would need to reopen. Mrs. MacLeod learning that her silver tea service, a family heirloom, had been stolen piece by piece. The Reverend discovering his mother's books were gone. 8 families, 8 stories of trust betrayed. But there was also the possibility of recovery, of returning at least some of what had been taken. The dealers would cooperate, eager to avoid charges of trafficking stolen goods. Some pieces might come home. He drove back to Lochdubh as darkness fell, the lights of the village appearing one by one like stars in the Highland night. Tomorrow he would begin the difficult task of telling people what had been done to them. Tonight he would sit with lugs by the fire and think about the different kinds of theft that existed in the world and which ones were truly unforgivable. Chapter 5. The village reckons with betrayal. News of Janet Morrison's crimes spread through Lochdubh with the speed that only small village gossip could achieve. By Tuesday morning, everyone knew about the notebook, the systematic thefts, the betrayal of trust that had occurred under the guise of compassionate care. The reaction was a mixture of shock, anger, and a kind of collective shame that they had all been fooled by such a pleasant-seeming woman. Hamish spent the day visiting the families whose names appeared in Janet's ledger. Each conversation was difficult in its own way, each family processing the revelation differently. Mrs. MacLeod wept when he told her about the silver tea service, her mother's silver, brought from Edinburgh when she married and moved to the Highlands. Janet had taken it piece by piece, 4 forks one week, 3 spoons the next, always small enough not to be immediately noticed. But she was so kind, Mrs. MacLeod said through her tears. She would sit with me and read, and all the while she was stealing from me. How could I have been so blind? You were ill, Hamish said gently. You trusted someone in a position of authority. That is not blindness. That is human decency. The Reverend Macpherson took the news with the quiet dignity expected of his profession, though Hamish could see the anger in his eyes. The stolen books had belonged to his mother, a collection of first editions she had treasured. The miniature painting had been a portrait of his grandmother. I suppose we are meant to forgive, the Reverend said quietly. That is what my faith teaches, but I find myself struggling with that today, Hamish. I truly do. Forgiveness is a process, Hamish replied. Not a moment. You do not have to rush it. But the most difficult conversation was with the Curry sisters, Nessie and Jessie, the village's resident gossips and moral arbiters. Their mother had been one of Janet's patients 2 years ago, and several pieces of jewellery had disappeared during her final weeks. We thought Mother had given them away, Nessie said, her face pale. We thought perhaps she had wanted someone else to have them, and her mind was too far gone to tell us. We felt guilty for even wondering where they had gone. Guilty, echoed Jessie, her twin. That was precisely what Janet counted on, Hamish said. Your guilt, your uncertainty, your unwillingness to accuse someone who seemed so caring. She exploited your best qualities. The sisters looked at each other, a moment of silent communication passing between them. Then Nessie straightened her spine and fixed Hamish with a steely gaze. Margaret Linden did what she did because we all failed, she declared. We should have noticed. We should have compared notes. If we had talked to each other instead of suffering in silence, Janet Morrison would have been stopped years ago. It was an astute observation, and one that Hamish had been thinking about himself. The thefts had continued because each family thought they were alone in their loss, too ashamed or uncertain to share their suspicions. By Wednesday, the village had moved from shock to something more complex. A debate had emerged, conducted in hushed voices at the post office and over tea at the hotel. Was Margaret Linden a murderer or an avenger? Had she committed a crime or administered justice that the legal system had failed to provide? The Curry sisters were firmly on Margaret's side. She did what had to be done, Nessie proclaimed in the post office, where a crowd had gathered around the bulletin board, where someone had posted the details of what items had been stolen from which families. Done, Jessie agreed. But Dr. Brodie, stopping by Hamish's cottage that evening, was more conflicted. Murder is murder, he said, accepting a dram of whiskey. I understand Margaret's anger, but she crossed a line that should not be crossed. What if she had gotten the wrong person? What if the gas had leaked and killed someone else at that sale? Hamish nodded. Those were the same questions that had been troubling him. Intent mattered in law, but so did outcome. Margaret had committed premeditated murder. That she had the right victim, that the victim was herself a criminal, did not change the fundamental nature of the act. Anderson called from Strathbane with news. We have recovered about 60% of the stolen items so far. Most of the dealers were cooperative once we showed them the evidence. Some pieces were already sold on, but we are tracking those down. The families should have most of their things back within the month. That is something, at least, Hamish said. What about Margaret? She is being formally charged with murder tomorrow. Blair is strutting about like he has solved the crime of the century. Never mind that she confessed and you found all the evidence. Anderson's voice carried a note of familiar frustration. The prosecutor is less enthusiastic. They know this case will be complicated. The defence will paint Janet Morrison as the real criminal, Margaret as a grief-stricken daughter driven to desperation. Will it work? Anderson sighed. In the Highlands? With a jury that will probably include people who knew these families? Hamish, I honestly do not know. That evening, Hamish walked down to the loch with lugs padding beside him. The water was dark and still, reflecting the first stars appearing overhead. The village lights glowed warmly behind him, each window a small beacon against the winter night. He thought about justice and mercy, about the law and what existed beyond it. Margaret Linden had murdered someone. That was fact. But she had done so to stop a predator who had escaped legal consequences, who had used her position to rob the vulnerable and the dying. The law was clear. Margaret would be convicted, would likely spend years in prison. But Hamish suspected that in the court of village opinion, the verdict would be far more nuanced. Janet Morrison would not be mourned, and Margaret Linden would not be condemned. The Highlands had their own sense of justice, older and more complex than statutes and legal codes. A figure approached through the darkness, and Hamish recognised Priscilla Halberton Smythe by her elegant stride. She had been away in London, but had returned 2 days ago, drawn back by news of the murder. "You are thinking deep thoughts," she observed, stopping beside him. "Just wondering about right and wrong," Hamish said, "and whether they are always as clear as we would like them to be." They stood together in silence, watching the reflection of stars on the dark water. Somewhere in Strathbane, Margaret Linden sat in a cell, waiting for a trial that would determine her fate. Somewhere in the village, families were receiving news that their stolen treasures might be returned. And somewhere beneath the loch's cold surface, Hamish thought, all the complicated truths of this case were settling like silt, waiting to see what would rise to the surface in the end. Chapter 6. The Prosecutor's Dilemma and the Village's Verdict. The preliminary hearing for Margaret Linden took place on a grey Friday morning in Strathbane Sheriff Court. Hamish attended, sitting in the public gallery and watching the legal machinery grind into motion. Margaret stood in the dock with the same composed demeanour she had maintained since her arrest, her grey hair neatly pulled back, her hands folded calmly before her. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Fiona Mackay, laid out the charges with professional efficiency. Premeditated murder by means of poison. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret had purchased the chemicals online. She had constructed the device. She had wrapped it attractively and placed it among the white elephant gifts, knowing or believing that Janet Morrison would select it. The defence solicitor, an older man named Donald Ross from Inverness, did not dispute the basic facts. Instead, he requested that the court consider the circumstances that had driven his client to such desperate action. He spoke of systematic theft, of betrayed trust, of a daughter watching her mother's final treasures vanish and finding no recourse in the law. Sheriff Campbell, presiding, listened to both sides with the weary expression of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker corners. He remanded Margaret for trial and set a date 3 months hence, allowing both sides time to prepare their cases. Outside the courthouse, Hamish found himself approached by Fiona Mackay. The prosecutor's expression was troubled, not the confident look of someone who had just secured an easy conviction. "Constable Macbeth," she said, "might I have a word?" They walked to a nearby cafe, ordered coffee and sat in a corner booth where they could speak privately. "This case," Mackay began, stirring her coffee with unnecessary vigour, "is a nightmare. I have a confession, clear evidence, and a sympathetic defendant. No prosecutor wants a sympathetic defendant. Janet Morrison was a thief," Hamish observed. "The notebook proves that. 8 families robbed over 3 years." "I know," Mackay said, "and that is the problem. My victim is also a criminal who was never caught, never charged, never punished. The defence will argue that Margaret Linden was driven to act because the system failed her." "And was she not?" Hamish asked quietly. Mackay looked up sharply. "You are supposed to be on the side of law and order, Constable." "I am on the side of truth," Hamish replied. "The law failed Margaret Linden. The police in Strathbane told her there was insufficient evidence to charge Janet Morrison. They sent her away with her documentation and her grief, and told her there was nothing they could do." The prosecutor was silent for a moment. "You know what a jury will do with this case? They will nullify. They will decide that while Margaret technically broke the law, justice was served. She will walk free, and we will have established a precedent that vigilante murder is acceptable if the victim deserves it. Or," Hamish suggested, "you could charge her with manslaughter. Argue that she was acting under extreme emotional disturbance. She would still face consequences, but not life in prison for removing a predator from the community." Mackay shook her head. "Blair would never allow it. He wants his murder conviction, and politically, I cannot be seen as going soft on crime." "But you know this prosecution is wrong," Hamish said. "I can see it in your face." "What I know," Mackay said tiredly, "is that my job is to prosecute crimes, not to decide which victims deserve justice. But you are right. This case troubles me in ways that most do not." Back in Lochdubh, the village had already reached its own verdict. A petition had been circulating, calling for leniency for Margaret Linden. Even people who had not been directly affected by Janet Morrison's thefts had signed it. The Reverend had signed, despite his earlier reservations. Dr. Brodie had signed. The Curry sisters had collected signatures with the zeal of crusaders. Mrs. Wellington cornered Hamish at the post office. "We are organising a fund for Margaret's legal defence," she announced. "Everyone is contributing, even Mr. Patel, and you know how careful he is with his money." "That is kind," Hamish said carefully. "But you realise she has confessed to murder?" Mrs. Wellington fixed him with a look that would have withered lesser men. "She killed someone who was robbing dying patients, Hamish. Someone who stole from my friend Helen Linden while she was losing her mind to dementia. Do not talk to me about murder as if it exists in a vacuum. Context matters." It was the same argument Hamish had been having with himself for days. Yes, context mattered. But so did the rule of law. If Margaret walked free, what message did that send? That murder was acceptable if you felt your cause was just. That was a dangerous road to walk. Yet when he thought about Janet Morrison's notebook, about the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable, about the gentle smile she had worn while stealing memories and heirlooms, he could not summon much sympathy for her fate. Anderson called that evening with an update. "We have recovered 80% of the stolen items now." Mrs. MacLeod got her silver tea service back. Most of it, anyway. 3 pieces were already melted down. The Reverend has his mother's books. The miniature painting is still missing, sold to a private collector in Edinburgh who is proving difficult to track down. How is Margaret? Hamish asked. Calm. She spends her time reading, refuses to express remorse. Ross, her solicitor, is tearing his hair out. He needs her to show some emotion, some regret, if he's going to have any chance of getting the charge reduced. She has regret, Hamish said, just not for what she did to Janet Morrison. That night, unable to sleep, Hamish sat by his window watching the village. Lights burned late in several cottages, people discussing the case, debating morality and justice over tea and whiskey. The Highlands had always had their own code, older than British law, more flexible and more personal. He thought about Margaret Linden sitting in her cell, reading books and waiting for trial. He thought about Janet Morrison's cottage, now empty and already listed for sale. He thought about the families recovering their stolen treasures, each item a reminder of both violation and restoration. Justice, he decided, was never as simple as legal codes made it seem. Real justice existed in the messy space between law and morality, between punishment and understanding. Margaret would face trial, would be judged by a jury of her peers. But Hamish suspected that whatever the legal outcome, the true verdict had already been rendered in the hearts and minds of Lochdubh. And that verdict, for better or worse, was complicated. Chapter 7. The items that came home and those that did not. The recovered stolen goods began arriving back in Lochdubh during the second week after Janet Morrison's death. Anderson drove up from Strathbane personally, treating each family's property with a care that Hamish appreciated. These were not just objects. They were pieces of people's histories, tangible connections to loved ones gone. Mrs. MacLeod's silver tea service was returned on a Tuesday morning. Anderson and Hamish carried the pieces into her cottage, each one wrapped carefully in tissue paper. The old woman unwrapped them one by one, her hands trembling, tears running down her weathered cheeks. "My mother brought these from Edinburgh," she said, holding a teaspoon up to the light. "See the hallmark? 1796. They survived the Highland clearances, 2 world wars and countless family troubles, and they nearly did not survive a nurse with sticky fingers. She made tea using the silver pot, insisting that Anderson and Hamish stay. They sat in her small parlour, drinking from china cups, while she told stories about her mother and grandmother, about the tea parties they had held, about the history contained in these simple silver objects. When they left, Mrs. MacLeod pressed a £20 note into Anderson's hand. "For the Police Benevolent Fund," she said firmly. "You brought my family home to me. The Curry sisters received their mother's jewellery on Wednesday. They opened the box together, their usual chattering silence falling into an uncharacteristic silence as they examined each piece. A brooch shaped like a thistle, a simple gold wedding band, a string of amber beads that glowed like trapped sunlight. Mother wore these beads to church every Sunday, Nessie said quietly. Every Sunday, Jessie echoed, touching them reverently. For the first time since Hamish had known them, the sisters seemed truly united in something beyond gossip and judgment. Their shared grief over their mother's loss and their shared relief at her treasure's return had softened something in their perpetually sharp edges. But not all the returns went smoothly. The Reverend's mother's books came back, but the miniature painting remained missing. The private collector in Edinburgh had purchased it legally from a dealer who had bought it legally from Janet Morrison. Proving it was stolen was complicated by the fact that the Reverend's mother had not reported the theft, had not even known it was gone before her death. "I am sorry," Anderson told the Reverend. "We are still working on it, but the legal situation is complex." Macpherson nodded, accepting this with his characteristic grace. "The books are enough. They were her favourites. She read them to me when I was a child. Having them back is a blessing." But Hamish saw the sadness in the minister's eyes. The painting had been of his grandmother, a small watercolour done by a local artist in the 1920s. It was not particularly valuable in monetary terms, but its personal worth was incalculable. By Friday, most of the recovered items had been returned. Hamish sat in his cottage that evening, making notes in his own notebook. Not all the families had gotten everything back. Some pieces, like the 3 silver forks from Mrs. MacLeod's set, were gone forever. But the majority had been recovered, and that was more than anyone had expected. The phone rang. It was Anderson, his voice carrying a note of excitement that was unusual for the normally reserved sergeant. "Hamish, we found the painting. The collector in Edinburgh is an art historian who specialises in Scottish watercolours. When we explained the circumstances, really explained what Janet Morrison had done and how the families were affected, she agreed to return it. She is even refusing to accept reimbursement for what she paid. Says it is the right thing to do." Hamish felt a warmth spread through his chest. In all the darkness of this case, small lights of human decency kept appearing. "That is wonderful news. I will tell the Reverend myself." "There is more," Anderson continued. "The collector has offered to authenticate all the recovered items and provide documentation of their provenance. She says what happened to these families is a crime against history as well as against individuals. She wants to help preserve the record of what was taken and what was returned." "That will mean a great deal to them," Hamish said. He walked over to the manse that evening, finding the Reverend in his study working on Sunday's sermon. The minister looked up, read something in Hamish's expression, and set down his pen. "You have news about the painting." "It has been found," Hamish said. "The collector is returning it. No reimbursement required. It should arrive next week." Macpherson closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Hamish. And thank her, this collector. Acts of kindness matter more than people realise." Walking home through the December night, Hamish reflected on the strange accounting of this case. Janet Morrison had stolen systematically for 3 years. Margaret Linden had murdered her. 8 families had been robbed. Most had been made whole again, or as whole as they could be. 1 woman sat in jail awaiting trial. Another woman was dead. In a purely legal sense, the case was straightforward. Murder had been committed. Justice, in the form of prosecution and punishment, would be served. But in the broader sense, in the human sense, nothing about this case was straightforward at all. The items that had come home carried stories with them. Each piece of silver, each book, each piece of jewellery was a thread in the tapestry of family history. Janet Morrison had tried to cut those threads, to steal not just objects, but memory and connection. Margaret Linden had stopped her, violently and permanently. As Hamish let himself into his cottage, Luggs greeted him with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd been alone for hours and considered this an unacceptable state of affairs. He bent to scratch the dog's peculiar ears, thinking about the items that had been returned and the one that had not, about justice and restoration, about the complicated arithmetic of right and wrong. Tomorrow he would begin preparing his report for the trial. He would document everything he had learned, everything he had observed. He would present the facts as he understood them and let the legal system do its work. But tonight he sat by his fire and thought about an art collector in Edinburgh who had chosen kindness over profit, about families holding treasures they thought lost forever, about the small victories that existed even in the darkest of cases. Those small victories, he thought, might be the closest thing to real justice that anyone could hope to find. Chapter 8. The Trial That Divided Opinion. The trial of Margaret Linden began on a cold Monday in March. The courthouse in Strathbane was packed, with villagers from Lochdubh filling most of the public gallery. The Curry sisters had secured front-row seats through sheer determination and early arrival. Dr. Brodie sat with his wife, Angela. The Reverend Macpherson was present, as were Mrs. MacLeod and several other families who had been victims of Janet Morrison's thefts. Hamish sat in the witness section, knowing he would be called to testify. He watched Margaret enter the courtroom, her bearing still composed, still calm. She looked thinner than she had 3 months ago, her face more drawn, but her eyes held the same steady determination he had seen in her kitchen that day. The jury was a mix of Highland residents, farmers and shopkeepers and retired teachers. Hamish studied their faces, trying to gauge how they might view this case. Some looked sympathetic to Margaret. Others wore expressions of stern disapproval. Most simply looked tired, as if they already sensed the complexity of the decision ahead of them. Fiona Mackay, the prosecutor, opened with a straightforward presentation of the facts. Margaret Linden had purchased chemicals. She had constructed a poison gas device. She had concealed it in attractive wrapping and placed it where Janet Morrison would likely select it. The nurse had died a painful, terrifying death. This was premeditated murder, plain and simple. The defense solicitor, Donald Ross, countered with a different narrative. Yes, Margaret had killed Janet Morrison, but she had done so after exhausting all legal remedies. She had gone to the police with evidence of systematic theft. She had been turned away, told there was nothing to be done. She had watched a predator continue to have access to vulnerable patients, knowing that more families would be robbed, and she had acted to prevent future harm. It was not, Ross argued, a case of revenge. It was a case of prevention, of desperate action taken when all other avenues had been closed. Hamish was called to testify on the second day. He laid out what he had found, the notebook detailing Janet Morrison's crimes, the systematic nature of the thefts, the families who had been victimised. He described Margaret's demeanour when he interviewed her, her lack of remorse, her clear belief that she had done what needed to be done. Under cross-examination, Mackay tried to establish that Hamish had been sympathetic to Margaret from the start, that his investigation had been coloured by bias. But Hamish answered each question truthfully. He had been sympathetic to Margaret's situation. He had also arrested her for murder. Those two facts were not contradictory. Dr. Brodie testified about the manner of Janet Morrison's death, the suffering she would have experienced. It was clinical testimony, factual and professional, but Hamish could see the jury's reaction. Several members looked disturbed, confronted with the reality of what Margaret had done. Then Ross called Mrs. MacLeod to the stand. The old woman, dressed in her Sunday best, described what it had felt like to discover her family's silver had been stolen. She spoke about trust, about inviting someone into her home during her most vulnerable time, about the betrayal of that trust. "I do not condone murder," Mrs. MacLeod said clearly, "but I understand why Margaret did what she did. When the people who are supposed to protect you fail, when the system tells you there is nothing to be done, what choice do you have?" Mackay objected, and Sheriff Campbell sustained it, instructing the jury to disregard Mrs. MacLeod's opinion on choice. But the words had been said, had been heard. The Curry sisters testified together, tag-teaming as they always did, describing their mother's stolen jewellery and their own guilt at not noticing sooner. The Reverend spoke about his mother's books and the painting, about the importance of family history and the violation of having it taken. Each testimony built Ross's narrative. Janet Morrison had been a systematic criminal. The legal system had failed to stop her. Margaret Linden had acted out of desperation and a desire to protect others. On the fourth day, Margaret herself took the stand. This was risky. Ross had advised against it, but Margaret had insisted. She wanted her voice heard. She spoke quietly but clearly, describing her mother's decline, the disappearance of the jewellery, her investigation of Janet Morrison's other thefts. She described going to the police in Strathbane, showing them her evidence, and being told it was not enough. "I went home that day," Margaret said, "and I thought about all the other families who would be robbed, all the other daughters who would watch their parents' treasures vanish and be told there was nothing they could do. And I decided I could not let that continue." "Did you plan to kill Janet Morrison?" Ross asked. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "I researched methods. I chose poison gas because I wanted her to know what was happening, to have a moment of understanding before she died. I wanted her to feel afraid, the way my mother felt afraid when she realized her things were disappearing and no one believed her." The courtroom was silent. Even Blair, sitting in the back row, seemed stunned by this naked honesty. Under Mackay's cross-examination, Margaret did not waver. Yes, she had intended to kill. Yes, she understood it was murder. No, she did not regret it. Janet Morrison would have continued stealing. Other families would have suffered. Margaret had stopped that. "Do you understand that you could go to prison for life?" Mackay asked. "Yes," Margaret said, "but I would make the same choice again." The prosecution rested. The defence rested. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following day. Hamish left the courthouse and walked through Strathbane's cold streets, thinking about what he had witnessed. Margaret Linden had signed her own conviction warrant with her testimony. She had admitted premeditation, lack of remorse, willingness to repeat the act. Any jury that followed the law strictly would have no choice but to convict her of murder. But juries were made up of human beings, not legal algorithms. They brought their own experiences, their own sense of justice to the deliberation room. And this jury had heard a compelling narrative about system failure and desperate action. Back in Lochdubh that evening, the village gathered at the hotel bar to discuss the trial. Opinion remained divided, though most fell on Margaret's side. Only a few, Dr. Brodie among them, maintained that murder could not be justified, no matter the provocation. Hamish sat alone at a corner table, nursing a whisky and thinking about tomorrow's closing arguments, about the jury's deliberation, about what verdict would serve justice in this impossible case. The answer, he suspected, was that no verdict could truly serve justice. The damage was done. Janet Morrison was dead. Margaret Linden had destroyed her own life to end another's. 8 families had been robbed and partially restored. There were no winners, only different degrees of loss. Sometimes, Hamish thought, that was all the law could offer. Not justice, not redemption, but an accounting of what had been broken and an attempt to prevent it from happening again. Tomorrow, a jury would decide Margaret Linden's fate, but the real judgment, Hamish suspected, had already been passed in the hearts of everyone touched by this case. Chapter 9. The jury speaks and the village reflects. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Hamish spent that time in Lochdubh, going through the motions of his regular duties while his mind remained on the courthouse in Strathbane. He dealt with a sheep wandering onto the road, mediated a dispute between neighbours about a fence line, and sat through tea with Mrs. Wellington, who spent the entire visit speculating about what the jury might decide. On Wednesday afternoon, his mobile rang. It was Anderson. Verdict is in. They are coming back in 20 minutes. Hamish drove to Strathbane faster than he should have, arriving just as the courtroom was filling up again. The same crowd from Lochdubh had returned, along with reporters from as far away as Edinburgh. This case had caught the public imagination. The story of a daughter's revenge against a thief who preyed on the dying. Margaret was led back into the dock. Hamish watched her face, searching for fear or hope, but found only that same calm acceptance she had shown throughout. She had done what she believed needed doing, had accepted the consequences, and now waited to hear what those consequences would be. Sheriff Campbell entered, and the room rose. The jury filed in, their faces giving nothing away. Hamish tried to read them, looking for signs of sympathy or condemnation, but Highland people were good at keeping their counsel. The clerk asked the foreman, a retired farmer named McTavish, if they had reached a verdict. "We have," McTavish said, his voice rough with age and years of Highland weather. "How do you find the defendant on the charge of murder?" There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever. Hamish held his breath. "We find the defendant guilty of culpable homicide." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Not murder, but culpable homicide, the Scottish legal term for what in other jurisdictions might be called manslaughter. It was a compromise verdict, acknowledging that Margaret had killed Janet Morrison, but finding that the circumstances reduced her culpability. Sheriff Campbell called for order, then turned to the jury. "On what grounds have you reached this verdict?" McTavish cleared his throat. "We find that the defendant acted under extreme provocation and emotional distress. While her actions were criminal and cannot be condoned, we recognize that the legal system failed to provide her with recourse against a proven thief. We also note her actions, while wrong, prevented future harm to vulnerable individuals." The sheriff nodded slowly. He had clearly expected this. Scottish juries had a long tradition of tempering strict law with human understanding, and this case cried out for such tempering. "Margaret Linden," he said, turning to address her directly, "you have been found guilty of culpable homicide. The maximum sentence for this crime is life imprisonment, though the circumstances allow for discretion. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say?" Margaret stood. "No, Your Honour. I have said all I need to say." Campbell studied her for a long moment. "I find myself in a difficult position," he said. "You have committed a serious crime. You have taken a life regardless of the character of the person whose life you took. Society cannot function if individuals take justice into their own hands." He paused, and Hamish could see him wrestling with the decision. However, I am also cognizant of the circumstances that led to your actions. You exhausted legal remedies. You acted not from malice, but from a desire to protect others. Your victim was indeed a criminal who exploited the vulnerable. These factors weigh in your favour. Another pause. The courtroom held its collective breath. I sentence you to 5 years imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 2 years. In addition, I am recommending that you receive counselling, and that consideration be given to your eligibility for a community service order after serving your minimum sentence. 5 years. It was far less than life, far less than the 15 to 20 years a murder conviction would have brought. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions. Some applauded, others looked disapproved. Mackay sat stone-faced, knowing this was the best outcome she could have hoped for given the circumstances. Margaret herself showed no reaction. She simply nodded, accepting this as she had accepted everything else. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the people from Lochdubh, seeking comments. The Curry sisters declared it a fair verdict. Dr. Brodie said he was relieved Margaret would not spend her life in prison, but maintained that violence was never the answer. The Reverend offered prayers for everyone involved and declined to comment further. Hamish drove back to Lochdubh as the March sun set behind the hills. He thought about justice and mercy, about the gap between what the law required and what human hearts deemed right. 5 years for a life taken. Was it enough? Too much? There was no objective answer. That evening the village gathered at the hotel again. Mrs. Wellington organised a collection for Margaret's commissary account in prison. Mr. Patel contributed generously, as did almost everyone else. Even those who thought she had been wrong acknowledged that she should not have to face her sentence without support. Priscilla found Hamish sitting alone at the bar. "You look troubled," she observed. "I am thinking about what has been accomplished," he said. "Janet Morrison is dead. Margaret Linden is going to prison. 8 families had their property stolen and mostly returned. Where is the victory in any of that?" "Perhaps there is not meant to be a victory," Priscilla suggested. "Perhaps sometimes the best outcome is simply that the truth came out, that the thief was stopped, and that the punishment fit both the crime and the circumstances. Not perfect, but as fair as an imperfect world allows." Hamish considered this. It was true that no more families would be robbed by Janet Morrison. That was something. It was also true that Margaret would pay for her crime, but not lose her entire life to it. That was something too. The legal system had failed initially, but it had found a way to acknowledge both the crime and the provocation. The jury had done what Highland juries did best, applying human judgment to human tragedy. As the evening wore on and the talk in the bar turned to other matters, Hamish felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. This case would stay with him, would make him think differently about justice and vengeance. But it would not destroy his faith in the possibility of right outcomes, only complicate his understanding of what right outcomes look like. He walked home through the quiet village, lugs at his heels. The loch reflected a thin moon and lights glowed in cottage windows. Somewhere, Margaret Linden was beginning her sentence. Somewhere, the families who had been robbed were treasuring their returned possessions. And here in Lochdubh, life continued in all its messy, complicated glory. Justice, Hamish thought, was never simple. But perhaps it did not need to be simple. Perhaps it only needed to be human. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Choices Made. Spring came to Lochdubh with a burst of green that transformed the hills overnight. By May, wildflowers dotted the moorland, and lambs filled the fields with their bleating. Life moved forward, as it always did, carrying the village with it into a new season. Hamish stood at his kitchen window one morning, watching mist rise from the loch. Luggs sat at his feet, hoping for bacon that would not be forthcoming until Hamish had his first cup of tea. 6 months had passed since Janet Morrison's death, 3 months since Margaret Linden's sentencing. The case had faded from newspaper headlines, though not from the memory of those involved. Margaret was serving her time at Cornton Vale, the women's prison outside Stirling. Hamish had visited her once, making the long drive south on his day off. She had looked thinner, older, but not broken. They had spoken about small things, about books she was reading, and the counselling she was receiving. She had not mentioned regret, and Hamish had not asked about it. The stolen items that had been recovered had found their way back into family homes and family use. Mrs. MacLeod's silver tea service graced her table for Sunday tea. The Curry sisters wore their mother's jewellery to church. The Reverend's mother's book sat on his shelf, and the recovered painting hung in his study. But the case had left its mark on Lochdubh in ways both subtle and profound. People were more careful now about who they allowed into their homes, more watchful of the elderly and vulnerable. A support group had formed for families dealing with dementia, partly to share resources and information, partly to ensure that what happened with Janet Morrison could never happen again. Dr. Brodie had worked with the Regional Health Board to implement new protocols for home care workers, including background checks and regular supervision. It was closing the barn door after the horse had bolted, as the saying went, but it might prevent future horses from bolting. The church had decided not to hold a white elephant sale that Christmas. The association was too dark, too painful. Instead, they would have a simple gift exchange with names assigned in advance. Mrs. Wellington had made this decision herself, and no one had argued with her. Anderson called one morning with news. Thought you would want to know. The parole board has indicated Margaret will likely be released after serving her minimum 2 years. She has been a model prisoner, has completed all the counselling requirements, and has expressed genuine insight into the harm caused by her actions. That is good news, Hamish said, meaning it. Margaret deserved a chance to rebuild her life. Where will she go? Anderson asked. Back to Lochdubh? Hamish doubted it. The village might have supported her, might have understood her actions, but returning to the scene of the crime would be difficult for everyone. No, I suspect she will start fresh somewhere else. That afternoon, Hamish drove up to Glen Hollow, the house where Malcolm Drummond had lived and died in a previous case. The place had been sold to a young couple from Edinburgh, city people looking for Highland peace. They had restored the garden and painted the house, bringing life back to a place that had known too much loneliness. It reminded him that places, like people, could be redeemed. What had been the scene of death and secrets was now a family home, filled with children's laughter and the smell of fresh paint. Time moved on, and with it came the possibility of transformation. He thought about Janet Morrison's cottage, still sitting empty and unsold. People were superstitious about houses where murders had occurred, even if the murder had not happened there. Eventually someone would buy it and make it theirs, would fill it with new memories that would overlay the old. Priscilla stopped by that evening, bringing fish and chips from the hotel. They sat in Hamish's small kitchen, eating from paper and talking about ordinary things. But eventually, as conversations in Lochdubh often did, the talk turned to the case. "Do you think Margaret was right to do what she did?" Priscilla asked. Hamish had thought about this question many times. "No," he said finally. "I think she was understandable, sympathetic even, but not right. There is a difference." What difference? Right would have been finding another way. Pushing harder at the legal system, going to the press, organising the families to bring a civil suit. Something that did not involve taking a life. But those things might not have worked, Priscilla pointed out. Probably not, Hamish agreed. But the certainty that something will not work does not justify murder. It only makes murder more tempting. They ate in silence for a moment. Then Priscilla said, "Janet Morrison got what she deserved, though. You cannot deny that." "I can deny it," Hamish said. "She deserved to be caught, tried, convicted and imprisoned. She deserved to have her crimes exposed and to face the consequences legally. She did not deserve to die choking on poison gas, no matter how many people she robbed. You have become very philosophical about this." Hamish smiled slightly. "Perhaps I have had too much time to think. Blair would tell you I should spend less time philosophizing and more time catching criminals." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Hamish's phone rang. It was indeed Blair, his voice booming across the line about a disturbance at a pub in Nothen. Hamish sighed, gathered his keys, and called for lugs. "Duty calls," he told Priscilla. "It always does," she replied, helping herself to the last chip. "Go on then. Save the Highlands from unruly drunks." Driving through the soft spring evening toward Carnothan, Hamish reflected on the arc of the White Elephant case. It had begun with a death, and ended with a conviction. Justice had been served after a fashion. The truth had emerged. A thief had been stopped, a murderer punished, and families had recovered most of what was stolen. But the cost had been high. 2 women's lives had been destroyed, one literally, one figuratively. A community had been forced to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, justice, and the price of revenge. The case would be remembered in Lochdubh, would be discussed in quiet voices for years to come. The Christmas when someone brought death to the white elephant sale. The nurse who robbed the dying. The daughter who took justice into her own hands. Hamish hoped the lasting legacy would not be division or bitterness, but rather a renewed commitment to watching out for the vulnerable, to questioning authority when it failed, to seeking justice through proper channels while recognizing that those channels sometimes required persistent pushing. The disturbance in Carnarvon turned out to be nothing more than a disagreement over a football match that had gotten slightly out of hand. Hamish sorted it out with his usual combination of patience and subtle authority, made sure everyone got home safely, and drove back to Lochdubh under a sky full of stars. As he pulled into his spot outside his cottage, he saw lights still burning in windows throughout the village. People watching television, reading books, talking over tea. Ordinary lives continuing in ordinary ways, touched by tragedy, but not defined by it. He thought about Margaret Linden in her prison cell, about Janet Morrison in her grave, about all the families sleeping soundly with their recovered treasures nearby. He thought about choices made and prices paid, about justice and its many complicated forms. Tomorrow would bring new calls, new problems, new small dramas to resolve. But tonight, Lochdubh was peaceful, and Hamish was grateful for the peace. He let himself into his cottage, poured a small whisky, and sat by his fire with lugs at his feet. The case was closed, the story was finished, but the questions it raised about right and wrong, about justice and mercy, about the price of vengeance and the cost of inaction, those questions would linger. They were the questions that made human beings human, Hamish thought. The questions that had no easy answers but demanded to be asked anyway. He raised his glass to absent friends and absent enemies, to victims and victimizers, to the messy business of being human in a world that rarely offered clear choices. And then he finished his whisky, called lugs to bed, and let the spring night settle softly over Lochdubh, carrying with it all the memories of winter and all the promises of the season to come, the end.